The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Bradley International Airport as Dr. Michelle Thompson pulled up to the private terminal in her black Mercedes. She was running exactly on schedule, as she always did. At 42 years old, Michelle had mastered the art of time management along with many other skills that had helped her climb to the top of the corporate ladder. She checked her appearance one last time in the rearview mirror. Her dark hair was perfectly styled in a professional bob, her makeup subtle but flawless. The pearl necklace her grandmother had given her for graduation rested against her crisp white blouse. Michelle always wore it for important meetings. It was her good luck charm. The security guard watching from his booth saw an expensive car, but couldn't make out the driver clearly through the tinted windows. He straightened his uniform and prepared to greet what he assumed would be another typical private jet client. Michelle gathered her things, the leather briefcase containing merger documents worth billions, her designer handbag, and the small carry-on she always kept packed for sudden business trips. As the CEO of Health First Solutions, one of the largest healthcare companies in America, she had gotten used to flying at a moment's notice. Today's trip to Chicago wasn't just another meeting. The merger she was working on would bring advanced medical technology to communities that desperately needed it. This was the kind of work that made all the sacrifices worth it, the late nights, the missed family events, the constant pressure to prove herself in rooms full of men who often assumed she was someone's assistant rather than the boss. As she stepped out of her car, Michelle's heels clicked against the polished floor of the private terminal. The sound echoed in the quiet space, mixing with the distant roar of jet engines. She had earned this position through 20 years of hard work, starting as an intern and working her way up, earning her PhD while holding down a full-time job. The valet approached with a warm smile, reaching for her car keys. "Good morning, Dr. Thompson. Another trip to Chicago?" "Yes, James," she replied with a genuine smile. Over the years, many of the regular terminal staff had become familiar faces. "How's your daughter doing in college?" "She's loving it, Dr. Thompson. That scholarship program you told us about made all the difference." Michelle felt a surge of pride. She had started a foundation to help promising students from low-income families pursue higher education. James's daughter had been one of the first recipients. As she walked toward the security checkpoint, Michelle mentally reviewed her presentation for the upcoming meeting. The merger would create thousands of new jobs and bring cutting-edge medical facilities to underserved areas. She had spent weeks perfecting every detail. Her phone buzzed with a message from her assistant. "Board members already in Chicago. Weather clear, jet-fueled and ready." Everything was proceeding according to plan. The private terminal was quieter than usual this morning. A few other executives waited in the luxury lounge area, some reading newspapers, others typing on laptops. Mitchell recognized several faces from various business meetings and charity events. Jerome Martinez, her regular pilot, waved from across the terminal where he was checking weather reports. They had flown together countless times, and she trusted his judgment completely. He had once diverted a flight to avoid a storm that other pilots tried to fly through, proving his commitment to safety over schedules. Michelle checked her watch. She was still 10 minutes ahead of schedule. The familiar pre-meeting excitement began to build in her chest. These were the moments she lived for, when she could make real changes happen, when her position and influence could open doors and create opportunities for others. She approached the security checkpoint, reaching for her ID and flight documentation. The morning sunlight streamed through the terminal's tall windows, catching her grandmother's pearls and making them gleam. Michelle stood tall, confident, and ready for another day of making history in her own quiet way. Little did she know that this routine business trip was about to become anything but ordinary, and that the next few hours would test her dignity, patience, and resolve in ways she never expected. James Whitaker had been working as a security guard at the private terminal for only 3 months. He stood at his post, back straight, watching the expensive cars come and go with their wealthy passengers. His new uniform still felt stiff, but the authority it gave him made him feel important. When Dr. Thompson approached his security checkpoint, Whitaker's expression changed. He quickly stepped forward, raising his hand in a stopping motion before she even reached the desk. The movement was sharp, almost aggressive, very different from the polite gestures he had shown to previous travelers that morning. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said loudly, emphasizing the ma'am in a way that made it sound less like respect and more like doubt. I think you might be lost. The main terminal is in the other building." Dr. Thompson kept her professional smile in place, though it didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. She had faced situations like this before. "No, I'm in the right place," she said calmly, holding out her identification and flight documents. "I'm Dr. Michelle Thompson, CEO of Health First Solutions. I have a private flight scheduled to Chicago this morning." Whittaker barely glanced at the documents. "These jets are very expensive, you know," he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "Are you sure you're not looking for a regular commercial flight?" Behind Dr. Thompson, other travelers were starting to notice the scene. A white executive in an expensive suit walked up to the checkpoint, and Whittaker immediately waved him through with a friendly nod, not even checking his documents. "I am quite aware of the cost," Dr. Thompson replied, her voice steady but firm. "I've been flying from this terminal twice a week for the past 3 years. Could you please check my documentation?" Whittaker picked up her papers with exaggerated slowness, making a show of examining each page. "These look a bit too perfect," he said suspiciously. "Almost like they could be fake. I'll need to call my supervisor to verify these." Dr. Thompson felt her heart racing, but years of dealing with prejudice in boardrooms had taught her to keep her composure. "Please do call your supervisor," she said. "And while you're at it, please explain why you just let that gentleman through without checking his documents at all." A small crowd was gathering now. Some people had their phones out, recording the interaction. Whittaker seemed to grow more defensive, space reddening. "I'm just doing my job," he insisted, reaching for his radio. "We have strict security protocols here." "Which apparently only apply to certain people," came a voice from behind them. Jerome Martinez, Dr. Thompson's pilot, had noticed the delay and come to investigate. He walked up to the checkpoint, his captain's uniform pristine, his expression stern. "Is there a problem here?" Jerome asked, though his tone made it clear he knew exactly what the problem was. "Dr. Thompson is one of our most frequent flyers. I've personally piloted her jets for the past 3 years." Whittaker's face grew even redder. "I still need to verify these documents with my supervisor," he insisted, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Then verify mine too," said the white executive who had been waved through earlier, stepping back to the checkpoint. "Since we're following strict protocols here." More phones were recording now. Someone in the crowd was making a call, speaking urgently into their phone about discrimination at the private terminal. Whittaker's radio crackled with his supervisor, asking what was causing the delay. Dr. Thompson stood perfectly still, her grandmother's pearls catching the morning light. She had built her career on staying calm in difficult situations, on turning challenges into opportunities for change. She watched as Whittaker fumbled with his radio, his authority crumbling under the weight of his own prejudice. "Your supervisor might also be interested in the security footage," she said quietly. "It should show quite clearly how differently you've been treating passengers this morning." The sound of quick footsteps echoed through the terminal as terminal management rushed toward the growing scene. In the distance, a jet engine roared, but Dr. Thompson's flight wouldn't be taking off on schedule. This morning had become about something much more important than a business meeting in Chicago. The terminal manager, Sarah Chen, rushed toward the security checkpoint with quick, purposeful steps. Her face showed concern as she took in the scene, the crowd with their phones raised. Dr. Thompson standing calm but tense, and Officer Whittaker still clutching the documents with a defensive posture. "What seems to be the problem here?" Sarah asked, though the growing number of whispers and recording phones told her this was already becoming a major incident. Before anyone could answer, Whittaker jumped in. "I'm following security protocols, ma'am. These documents need extra verification." His voice wavered slightly as he tried to sound professional. Dr. Thompson took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every eye in the terminal on her. She had faced discrimination before, but never quite this public, never quite this blatant. The pearls at her neck felt heavy, like they were choking her. "Your officer," she began, her voice clear and controlled, "has been selectively enforcing these protocols. In the past 10 minutes, he has waved through 3 other executives without checking any documentation. I, however, was immediately stopped and accused of being in the wrong place." Sarah's expression darkened as she looked at the gathering crowd. Several people nodded in confirmation. The white executive who had been waved through earlier stepped forward. "It's true," he said. "I walked right through. He didn't even look at my ID. But Dr. Thompson here was treated like she was trying to sneak in. The terminal grew quieter as more people stopped to watch. A young woman in a business suit was typing rapidly on her phone, her face showing anger. "This is going straight to corporate," she muttered, loud enough for others to hear. Whitaker's radio crackled again. "Status update on the delay?" a voice demanded. Dr. Thompson watched as Sarah reached for the radio. 20 years of corporate experience had taught her to recognize pivotal moments, and this was one of them. The humiliation was still there, burning in her chest, but something else was building too, a determination to ensure this incident led to real change. "I've been flying from this terminal for 3 years," Dr. Thompson continued, addressing Sarah directly. "I know most of the staff by name. I've held board meetings in your conference rooms. Yet today, I was told these jets are very expensive and that I must be looking for the main terminal." A gasp went through the crowd. Someone muttered, "That's straight-up racism." Jerome, the pilot, stepped closer to Dr. Thompson. "We're now running late for a crucial meeting in Chicago," he said. "A meeting where Dr. Thompson is leading a merger discussion worth billions of dollars. This delay isn't just embarrassing, it's costly." Sarah looked horrified. "Dr. Thompson, I cannot apologize enough for this treatment. Officer Whitaker, please step aside. We'll need to discuss this incident in detail later." But Whitaker wasn't done. His face had turned an even darker shade of red. "I still need to verify these documents," he insisted, his voice rising. "They could be fake. Anyone could print these up and—" "Enough." Sarah's voice cut through the terminal like a whip. "Officer Whitaker, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. Please report to HR." The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Thompson stood there, feeling a complex mix of emotions. The humiliation was still fresh, but there was also a sense of validation seeing others recognize and call out the injustice. A young black woman in the crowd caught Dr. Thompson's eye and gave her a small nod of understanding. How many others had faced similar treatment but hadn't had witnesses or the position to fight back? As Whitaker finally stepped aside, his shoulders slumped in defeat, Dr. Thompson picked up her documents with steady hands. The morning sun still streamed through the terminal windows, but it felt different now, less warm, more revealing. "Ms. Chen," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet terminal, "I'll need copies of all security footage from this morning. And I'd appreciate the contact information for your corporate office. This isn't over, not because I want revenge, but because real change requires more than just removing one person." The crowd began to disperse, but their phones stayed out, uploading videos that would soon spread across social media. What had started as a routine morning had turned into a moment that would force many to confront an uncomfortable truth about prejudice in seemingly professional spaces. Jerome Martinez had seen a lot in his 15 years as a private jet pilot, but this morning's events made his blood boil. Standing beside Dr. Thompson, he pulled out his phone and began recording everything himself, making sure to capture clear footage of the terminal's security cameras. "I think it's time we made some calls," he said firmly, his pilot's uniform catching the morning light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone. "Starting with the FAA." The mention of the Federal Aviation Administration caused Sarah Chen's face to pale slightly. Having the FAA involved could mean serious trouble for the terminal's operating license. She quickly stepped forward, holding up her hands. "Please, let's all move to my office," she said, gesturing toward a glass-walled room nearby. "We can handle this professionally." Dr. Thompson shook her head. "No, Sarah, this needs to happen right here, where everyone can see it. The same way everyone saw what just happened to me." The crowd that had gathered murmured in agreement. Among them was Marcus Reynolds, a senior executive from another company who had witnessed everything. He stepped forward, straightening his tie. "I've been flying from this terminal for 8 years, Marcus announced loudly. "And I've seen this kind of thing happen before, but never said anything. That stops today." He turned to Dr. Thompson. "Ma'am, I'm willing to provide a formal statement about what I've witnessed here and in the past." More people began stepping forward. A flight attendant named Jessica spoke up next. "Officer Whitaker has done this before," she said. "Last week, he gave a hard time to a black pilot, questioning his credentials repeatedly." The terminal buzzed with nervous energy as more stories emerged. Dr. Thompson listened carefully, making mental notes. Her merger meeting in Chicago was important, but this had become something bigger. Jerome was still on his phone, but now he was talking to the jet's co-pilot. Dave, call ahead to Chicago. Tell them Dr. Thompson will be delayed due to a discriminatory incident at the terminal. Yes, document everything. Sarah Chen watched helplessly as the situation spiraled beyond her control. Her phone was buzzing constantly now, likely calls from corporate headquarters as videos of the incident began circulating online. A young intern who had been quietly observing everything suddenly spoke up. I have all the security footage from the past 3 months backed up on our servers, she said, including the incidents others are mentioning. Dr. Thompson turned to face her. What's your name? Emmy Zhang, Dr. Thompson. I'm the intern. I've been keeping records because I saw a pattern, but I didn't know what to do about it. Sarah Chen's face showed shock. She hadn't known about any of this. Jerome stepped forward again, his presence commanding attention. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice carrying across the terminal. We're going to document every incident, every single one, and we're going to make sure this isn't just about removing one prejudiced security guard. Dr. Thompson nodded, pulling out her own phone. I'm calling my company's legal team, not to file a lawsuit, she added, seeing Sarah's panicked expression, but to help draft a comprehensive anti-discrimination policy for this terminal, one with real teeth. The crowd had grown larger now, with airport staff from other areas coming to see what was happening. Among them were other security guards, watching uncomfortably as their colleagues' actions exposed deeper problems in their system. Every person who has experienced discrimination here deserves to be heard, Dr. Thompson continued. And every person who stayed silent when they saw it happen needs to understand why that silence was part of the problem. Jerome checked his watch. The jet can wait, Dr. Thompson. This is more important than any merger meeting. She smiled for the first time since the incident began. You're right, Jerome. Sometimes leadership means knowing which crisis needs your immediate attention. As if on cue, Sarah's phone rang again. This time she answered it on speaker. Ms. Chen, a stern voice said, We've seen the videos. Corporate is sending a team to the terminal immediately. Don't let anyone leave until they arrive. The morning sun now streamed fully through the terminal's windows, illuminating dust particles in the air, making visible what had been invisible, just as this incident had exposed problems that had been ignored for far too long. Within an hour of the incident, the private terminal had transformed into a hub of intense activity. Corporate representatives arrived wearing serious expressions and carrying laptops. They set up in one of the conference rooms, its glass walls offering no privacy from the curious eyes of passengers and staff. Amy Zhang, the intern, sat at her computer station, pulling up file after file of security footage. Her hands moved quickly across the keyboard as she organized 3 months' worth of video evidence. On her screen, multiple instances of discriminatory behavior played out in silent, damning detail. Look at this one, she said, pointing to footage from 2 weeks ago. Same security checkpoint, same guard, but completely different treatment based on who was walking through. The corporate team leaned in, taking detailed notes. One of them, a woman named Patricia Wang from the HR department, shook her head in disbelief. Meanwhile, social media was exploding. The videos taken by witnesses had gone viral, spreading across multiple platforms. Hashtag #PrivatTerminalRacism and hashtag #DrThompson stands were trending nationally. News vans began appearing outside the terminal, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. Dr. Thompson sat in the terminal's VIP lounge, surrounded by her impromptu support team. Jerome hadn't left her side, and Marcus Reynolds was making calls to his own corporate contacts. The young black woman from the crowd earlier had introduced herself as Kendra Williams, a civil rights attorney who happened to be traveling that day. The evidence is overwhelming, Kendra said, reviewing the footage on her tablet. Not just from today, but the pattern over months. This isn't just about one guard. It's about a system that allowed this to continue. Sarah Chen entered the lounge, looking exhausted. Dr. Thompson, the CEO of our parent company, is on his way. He's cutting short his vacation in Europe to handle this personally. Outside the terminal's windows, more news vans were pulling up. Local stations had picked up the story, and national networks were calling for comments. Dr. Thompson's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support from other executives and business leaders. Emmy rushed into the lounge, her young face flushed with excitement and nervousness. Dr. Thompson, I found something else. The security company that hired Officer Whitaker. They've had similar incidents at other locations. I found news reports and complaints going back 2 years. The corporate team exchanged worried glances. This was bigger than they'd initially thought. Jerome checked his phone and let out a low whistle. The story just hit the major news networks. They're calling it a watershed moment for exposing discrimination in luxury services. Dr. Thompson stood up, straightening her jacket. Her grandmother's pearls caught the light, reminding her of all the barriers that generation had faced, and how many still remained to be broken. Get me the contact information for every person who's filed a complaint about discrimination at this terminal, she said firmly. And I want to know about every other terminal operated by this company. Sarah nodded quickly, relief showing on her face that Dr. Thompson was taking charge of the situation, already working on it. We've set up a hotline for people to report past incidents. The terminal's regular activities had almost ground to a halt. Other travelers delayed their flights, wanting to witness what was unfolding. Some shared their own stories of discrimination faced at various terminals and high-end services. Kendra was organizing the growing mountain of evidence on her laptop. This is going to change things, she said. Not just here, but across the industry. Sometimes it takes one high-profile incident to expose what many have faced in silence. Dr. Thompson watched as more corporate officials hurried through the terminal doors. Among them, she recognized board members from various companies, all looking concerned about the implications for their own organizations. The Chicago meeting can wait, she said to Jerome. Right now, we need to make sure this exposure leads to real change. Amy appeared again, this time with a stack of printed emails. More reports coming in, she said. Other terminals, other guards, similar stories. It's like a dam breaking. Outside, the afternoon sun had replaced the morning light. But inside the terminal, everything was being illuminated. Years of ignored complaints, silent witnesses, and systemic bias were finally being exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. The story that had started with one guard's prejudice was rapidly becoming a national conversation about privilege, access, and the often invisible barriers that remained in place even in the most exclusive spaces. By evening, the private terminal had become the center of a media storm. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing the steady stream of corporate executives and civil rights leaders arriving through the main entrance. Officer Whitaker sat alone in the HR office, his security badge and uniform laid out on the table in front of him. The morning's events played on a TV mounted on the wall, his face clearly visible in videos being shared across every major news network. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately, the HR director said, sliding paperwork across the table. The company will be conducting a full investigation into your past behavior. Meanwhile, in the main terminal area, Dr. Thompson stood surrounded by reporters. She had changed from defensive mode to decisive action, her voice steady as she addressed the cameras. This isn't about one person or one incident, she said, her grandmother's pearls gleaming under the camera lights. This is about changing a culture that allows discrimination to hide behind protocols and procedures. The consequences were spreading like ripples in a pond. The security company that employed Whitaker faced a crisis as more stories emerged. Their stock price dropped sharply as major clients began reviewing their contracts. Sarah Chen received notice that she was being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into her management oversight. The terminal's parent company announced an emergency board meeting to address the situation. 6 other terminals have already suspended their contracts with the security company, Jerome reported, showing Dr. Thompson his tablet. And 3 major airlines are conducting internal reviews of their own security practices. Social media continue to explode with similar stories. #CheckYourPrivilege and #TerminalTruth dominated trending topics. Videos of the morning's incident had been viewed millions of times, sparking heated discussions about racial profiling in luxury spaces. Kendra Williams, the civil rights attorney, had set up a temporary office in one of the terminal's conference rooms. A steady stream of people came forward to share their experiences of discrimination at various terminals and high-end venues. We've received over 200 reports just today, she told Dr. Thompson. People who were questioned, delayed, or denied access based on their race. Many never reported it because they didn't think anyone would listen. The terminal's parent company CEO finally arrived from Europe, looking jet-lagged but serious. He immediately called an emergency press conference. Effective immediately, we are implementing a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, he announced. We're establishing an independent oversight committee and mandatory bias training for all employees. But most importantly, we're listening to those who have faced discrimination in our facilities. Amy Jean, the intern who had preserved the security footage, received a promotion to full-time security systems analyst. Her first task would be developing a new system to monitor and flag potentially discriminatory behavior. Dr. Thompson's phone rang constantly with calls from other corporate leaders seeking her advice on preventing similar incidents in their organizations. Major companies began announcing reviews of their own security protocols and customer service practices. The white executive who had been waved through earlier, Marcus Reynolds, spoke to the press about his role in enabling discrimination through silence. We who benefit from privilege have a responsibility to speak up when we see others being treated unfairly, he said. By nightfall, Officer Whittaker's face appeared on national news broadcasts. Reporters discovered he had been fired from 2 previous security jobs for similar behavior, but those incidents had been quietly handled and hidden. The security company's CEO has resigned, Jerome informed Dr. Thompson, showing her another news alert. Their board is promising a complete overhaul of hiring and training practices. Dr. Thompson finally sat down in a quiet corner of the terminal, exhausted but determined. The merger meeting in Chicago had been rescheduled, but something more important had been accomplished. Sometimes, she said to Jerome, who hadn't left her side all day, the most important business deals aren't the ones on your schedule. As the day drew to a close, the terminal buzzed with activity of a different kind. Corporate trainers were already arriving to begin new sensitivity programs. Security protocols were being rewritten. And most importantly, people were finally talking openly about experiences they had previously kept silent. The consequences of one guard's actions had triggered a chain reaction that promised to reshape not just one terminal, but an entire industry's approach to equality and respect. Sometimes, real change starts with one person being brave enough to say enough. 3 weeks after the incident, the private terminal looked very different. New signs hung on the walls stating "Everyone welcome," "Everyone respected" in multiple languages. Security guards wore body cameras, and a diverse team of customer service representatives now greeted travelers at the entrance. Dr. Thompson walked through the terminal doors, noticing the changes immediately. The security checkpoint where she had faced discrimination now had 2 officers working together, a policy implemented to ensure accountability. They greeted every traveler with the same respectful nod and professional courtesy. "Good morning, Dr. Thompson," said Maria Rodriguez, one of the new customer service representatives. She had been hired as part of the terminal's initiative to build a more diverse staff. The training session is ready to begin in Conference Room A. Inside the large conference room, 40 people sat waiting. They were security personnel and customer service staff from private terminals across the country. Dr. Thompson had been invited to lead their first mandatory anti-bias training session. Amy Jean, now the head of security systems analysis, stood up to present the new monitoring system she had developed. "Our AI-powered cameras can now detect patterns of differential treatment," she explained, showing slides on the large screen. But technology is only part of the solution. The real change must come from people. The terminal's new chief of diversity and inclusion, Marcus Reynolds, had left his executive position to take on this role. He believed his privilege gave him a responsibility to create change. "We're not just changing rules," he told the group. "We're changing culture." In another part of the terminal, Kendra Williams met with a team of lawyers. They were finalizing details of a new industry-wide reporting system. Any traveler who experienced discrimination could now file a report through an independent oversight committee. "Look at these numbers," Kendra said, pointing to her laptop screen. "Since implementing the new policies, customer satisfaction scores have actually increased across all demographic groups. Treating people fairly is good for business." Jerome, who still piloted Dr. Thompson's flights, had become an advocate for change in his own right. He now led workshops for flight crews about recognizing and addressing bias. "The skies should be friendly for everyone," became his motto. Sarah Chen had returned from administrative leave with a new perspective. Instead of being fired, she had asked to be part of the solution. Now she worked with the Oversight Committee, using her experience to identify potential problems before they occurred. "Last month, we handled over 5,000 travelers," Sarah reported to the training group. "Not a single discrimination complaint was filed. But we're not declaring victory. We're staying vigilant." The changes weren't just cosmetic. The terminal had revised its entire security protocol. Now, every traveler followed the same clear procedures displayed on easy-to-read signs. No more arbitrary additional checks or special verifications. Dr. Thompson watched as the training session participants practiced scenarios. They role-played difficult situations, learning to recognize their own biases and handle conflicts professionally. The room buzzed with engaged discussion and honest questions. "Sometimes people ask why we spend so much time on this training," Dr. Thompson told the group. "They say it takes away from other duties. But treating every person with dignity isn't extra work, it's the foundation of good service." Outside the conference room, regular terminal operations continued smoothly. A diverse mix of travelers moved through security without incident. The new system was proving that efficiency and equality could go hand in hand. The terminal's parent company had seen unexpected benefits. Their stock price had recovered and even increased as other companies sought their advice on implementing similar changes. They were becoming known as industry leaders in inclusive practices. "We've had executives from hotels, restaurants, and other luxury services visit to study our new system," Marcus told Dr. Thompson proudly. "What happened here is creating change far beyond our walls." As the training session ended, Dr. Thompson checked her watch. She had her own flight to catch, another merger meeting in Chicago. But this time, she knew every person who walked through these terminal doors would be treated with the same respect she now received. "Change isn't just about fixing what's broken," she told the group as they prepared to leave. "It's about creating something better than what existed before. And that's exactly what we're doing here, one day at a time." The afternoon sun streamed through the terminal's windows, illuminating the faces of people committed to making a difference. The incident that had started with one guard's prejudice had transformed into a movement for lasting change across an entire industry. 6 months after the incident, Dr. Michelle Thompson stood at a podium in the main hall of the National Civil Rights Museum. The room was packed with business leaders, activists, and media representatives. Her grandmother's pearls caught the light as she prepared to speak. "Change doesn't happen by accident," she began, looking out at the diverse crowd. "It happens when we refuse to accept discrimination as normal, when we stand up not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us." In the front row sat many familiar faces from that fateful morning at the terminal. Jerome, her loyal pilot, smiled encouragingly. Amy Zhang, now a rising star in security systems development, took notes on her tablet. Marcus Reynolds, who had transformed from a bystander into an active advocate, nodded in agreement. 6 months ago, I was humiliated at a private terminal," Dr. Thompson continued. "Today, that same terminal leads the industry in inclusive practices. But this isn't just about one place or one incident." She clicked to the next slide, showing impressive statistics. Over 200 private terminals across the country had adopted the new anti-bias protocols. Customer complaints about discrimination had dropped by 89%. Employee satisfaction scores had risen by 45%. Kendra Williams, the civil rights attorney who had witnessed the original incident, stood up to present the legal changes that had been implemented. "We've created a system where accountability isn't optional," she explained. "It's built into every level of operation." The former security guard, James Whitaker, had become an unexpected part of the story. After losing his job, he had gone through intensive bias training and now spoke at schools about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of treating everyone with respect. "Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest growth," Dr. Thompson said, revealing the next phase of their initiative. She announced the creation of the Equality in Service Foundation, funded by major companies across the luxury service industry. The foundation would provide scholarships for minority students entering the aviation and hospitality fields. It would also fund ongoing training programs and support research into preventing discrimination in customer service. Sarah Chen, who had transformed from a worried terminal manager into a dedicated advocate for change, presented data showing how the new inclusive practices had actually improved efficiency and profitability. When we stopped wasting time on discriminatory practices, Sarah explained, we found better ways to ensure everyone's safety and comfort. Our terminals now process more travelers with fewer delays and higher satisfaction rates. Dr. Thompson unveiled the Foundation's first major project, a nationwide mentorship program connecting experienced executives with promising young professionals from underrepresented groups. Already, 500 mentorship pairs have been matched. But our work isn't finished, she reminded the audience. Change isn't a destination, it's a journey we must commit to every day. The crowd stood and applauded as Dr. Thompson announced that her company, Health First Solutions, would double its commitment to diversity initiatives. Other CEOs in attendance followed suit, pledging their support. After the presentation, Dr. Thompson walked through the museum's exhibits with her young niece, Maya. They stopped at a display about Rosa Parks, and Maya looked up at her aunt with proud eyes. Like you, Auntie Michelle, Maya said, she didn't let anyone tell her she didn't belong. Dr. Thompson touched her grandmother's pearls, thinking about all the women who had paved the way for this moment. And now it's our job to make sure everyone belongs, everywhere. Later that evening, as she prepared to board her private jet, Dr. Thompson noticed something different. The terminal was buzzing with diverse travelers and staff, all moving through security with ease and dignity. No one was being questioned about whether they belonged. Jerome met her at the plane, flight plan in hand. Ready for takeoff, Dr. Thompson? She looked back at the terminal one last time. The sun was setting, casting long shadows, but inside the building, every space was brightly lit. No more dark corners where discrimination could hide. Yes, she said, climbing the stairs to the jet. We're definitely ready for takeoff. As the plane rose into the evening sky, Dr. Thompson smiled, knowing that somewhere, her grandmother would be proud. What had started as a moment of humiliation had grown into a movement for lasting change. And this was just the beginning.